Welcome to class. Hello. So, welcome back to WCHS, you people. Social 30. Easiest class ever? You're like, you know what? I thought I had heard that it could be difficult, and so far, it's been simple. So if that's not the case, I'm hoping that today I can simplify things for you. So we're going to begin with a bit of a review, because we have, even though we've only had, I don't really count, but let's say 8 days together, we have had a lot of content presented to you, and I want to reiterate how it fits together before we start packing on case studies. So let us begin. This course is about ideologies. If that's news to you, then we have bigger problems than I had feared. The name ideology is even on the textbook. Remember our first class, I asked you to define ideologies for me, and nobody knew. That was what I would say a bad sign. That's like, oh crap, my class is not prepared. But we did find out that an ideology is the way you see the world. It's your beliefs, your values, your assumptions. It's the world that you see now, but it's also the world you want to see in the future. It's a combination of things. It's influenced by our experiences. It can be influenced by ideas like our relationship to the earth, our concept of gender, our concept of religion and spirituality. The textbook does a fine job unpacking the themes that help define ideologies. How will you be tested on the concept of ideology? Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes on the multiple choice, we'll have questions that it will be important for you to know these influences and themes of ideologies that are outlined in the intro to the textbook on pages like 24 and 25. There might be one or two multiple choice out of 60 on the diploma. More so though, this just gives us a beginning of the course. Because once we understand what an ideology is, we begin to understand what some possible ideologies are. So one thing we looked at was, we talked about, do you enjoy the status quo? You know, if the ideology is the way you see the world, the way you want to see the world in the future, do you want to see the same world in the future? Do you want to see very little change? Then politically we call you a conservative. But maybe you want to see some progress. You do want to see some changes. You want to see gender redefined. You want to see social roles redefined. You want to see the extension of individualism and liberty. We start using the word liberal, that you believe in progressive change. Liberals and conservatives make up the majority of people. They are in the middle of the political spectrum. They're what we'd call the voice of moderation. But voices can sometimes become a little more extreme. On the right side, extremists are called reactionary. And how do we know they're extreme? They're committed to using violence to recreate an old world. The world they want to see is a world we've already had. That's regressive change, reactionaries, like Islamic fundamentalists that use violence to try to convince the Americans to stay out of the Middle East so they can recreate the 7th century, the time of Muhammad. On the left, we have radicals that might use violence to try to achieve progressive change. In the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks were willing to use violence to overthrow the feudalist regime in Russia, that was a progressive change because Russia had never had communism before. So we began by looking at ideology, and then we started saying, what are some possible ideologies? Well, we can sometimes group them into categories, like how much change do you want to see in the world? And we call those groupings the political spectrum. So that was one thing we did. How will you be tested on this? Within a multiple choice test, we might give you a ideology. We might explain one to you. Might be a quote. And then you might have to label it. Is this reactionary, conservative, liberal, or radical? So you will be tested on a multiple choice test. You will have to be able to match these categories with ideologies. Another way you could be tested is in an A1. There might be a source, and as you unpack the ideological perspective of the source, it might be more specific or sound, proficient, PF 80%, for you to label the voice behind the source as being reactionary, conservative, liberal, or radical. This is a political spectrum. Also included under the idea of ideology, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Also included under the idea of ideology is the ideas of role of government, role of citizen, and the nature of mankind. So what is the role of government? You know, should the government, it's gonna break. Should the government, maybe it's already broken, control us? Or should the government unlock our freedom? What is the role of government in society? What's the role of citizen? Should we obey the government? Should we question the government? And what is the nature of mankind? I presented this to you in this format. If this, then what? And I think answering that question is key to essays, A2s. On an essay, there will be a source presented to you that has an issue and a solution embedded in it, and then you're meant to continue that conversation. You analyze it, you unpack it, and then you respond to it. In your response, you should connect to the nature of mankind. If it's an economic source, you might say, because mankind is selfish, because we're exploitive, we need government to regulate our human nature. We need legislation in place that protects children from exploitation, like the Factory Acts of 1833. Or we need oversight to prevent things like what Upton Sinclair observed in the jungle, which was, the misreporting of what's in the sausage, right? Or occupational health safety. They need to make sure that there's not danger to the employees. Ultimately, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory shows, if this then what, because mankind is exploitive and irrational and selfish, then government needs to regulate our economic activities. Or you might consider the fact that, no, mankind is rational. It's government that is irresponsible, and therefore, to unlock the wealth of the nation, we need to eliminate government from our economic lives. So that's how this leaks into an essay. That's how you'll be tested on that. So we began the course defining ideology, looking at the political spectrum, talking about some themes within it, and then we started breaking off a little bit. One of the key things that we broke off into was the idea that we have two groupings of ideologies. We have individualism and we have collectivism. If ideologies are a list of beliefs and values and assumptions, and this is the ideal world they want to shape, we need to begin to understand how an individual sees the world. What values do they want to promote? Economically, self-interest. Collectivist, they believe in collective interest. Economically, the manifestation of self-interest is private property. Collectivists see public property. Politically, individualists might promote democracy and self-government, whereas politically collectivists might say that we need to submit to the authority of the state. Whereas collectivists see the need for conformity and uniformity, individualists believe in the uniqueness that should be celebrated in each of us. So in our notes on this, I took a document from the 30-2 textbook that has a list, a T-chart comparing individualism and collectivism, and we continued that from pages 71 to 85 of this textbook. The values of individualism, the values of collectivism. We need to know those values because we need to look for them inside an A1. So when we have an A1 source, we have to say, this source is reflecting self-interest, or it's rejecting self-interest. It's exposing. So the source that had the clovers, it was exposing the the inhumane aspect of self-interest, as the one clover was down on his luck and the other clovers were ignoring the plight of that marginalized citizen. So by presenting it as a critique of self-interest, it was suggesting that the role of government should be to inject itself and create freedom through government. That's how that leaks into an A1 test. So we have individualism and collectivism. We started looking at their relative beliefs and values, assumptions and bias, the way that they see the world. This entire course, you'll be coming back to these ideas of individualism and collectivism. So it's in your interest to have, T-charts going. This is what individualists like, this is what collectivists like. These are arguments against individualism, these are arguments against collectivism. The more you can create this archive, the easier the course begins to become. It's not enough just to have a list generally of what they believe. Then we want to have a specific, okay, what would a specific individualist say? So under specific individualist in our cast of characters so far, we have individuals like Locke and Mill and Voltaire and Adam Smith and Ayn Rand, Emma Goldman, among others. So another task that you have this year is to keep a cast of characters. And as we keep an inventory of their ideology, not only will that help us unlock A1s, because we might see their ideology as an undertone within an A1, not only will it help us with an A2, because we can present their ideologies as arguments and evidence in our essays, you will be tested on their ideologies in multiple choice. The multiple choice practice that we've had so far, we've seen these names on them. So the need to be able to understand what their ideologies are and to distinguish them will be key to success in the course. So for each person, you might want to look at them and say, how do they feel about liberalism? Is it something to be celebrated or something to be challenged? And if it needs to be challenged, can we reform it or do we replace it? Within their vision of the world, what is the role of government? What is the role of citizen? What should the future look like? So we have Locke and Mill and Voltaire and Adam Smith and Ayn Rand and Goldman, that each of them, to some varying degree, they want to unlock the potential of the individual. But we need to have that cast of characters list. And with Voltaire, you should have attached to him the idea that freedom of speech is paramount. We need to be able to question those institutions within society, like at his time the Catholic Church, that had been above question. That he wants to see accountability and transparency of those institutions. That although he didn't say it himself directly, he's credited with the idea of, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. That's how absolute the First Amendment right of freedom of speech needs to be. That if you take away that critical right, you take away all other liberty. Whereas Adam Smith didn't talk about the freedom of speech. So one of the problems that students run into is when they're writing an essay and they're like, well, I want to put in an individualist. These are all individualists, but they all don't fit the task at hand. It's kind of like you have a toolbox. You need a tool, you can open it up, and you're right, a wrench and a hammer can sometimes do the same job, but sometimes a wrench can do that job better, or a hammer can do it better. In order to go up to an S, a PF, and an E, you have to be more precise and more deliberate with who you're using and how you use them. We need to differentiate their ideologies. So when I'm done, I'm going to be asking you, do you need me to repeat any of the ideologies of the individuals on the board? But each day you need to be adding to it. And you can't keep adding names if you don't have the key names to begin with. So key names politically and socially, in terms of supporting individualism, would be Locke. That's a key name politically and socially. Mill and his harm principle might be the next important one. Voltaire, already, he's the freedom of speech person. Adam Smith and Rand, they're not political philosophers. If you use them to defend democracy, you should fail your essay. Because you're confused. You're using the wrong tools. So Adam Smith and Ayn Rand they are capitalists. They're economic philosophers. Later we'll see we'd add Hayek and Friedman to that list. And the more that you can kind of, chunk together, Ayn Rand, Hayek, Friedman, Smith, they all believe in a free market, free of government. It makes the course more easy. Then on the collectivist side, who's the opposite of Locke? It's Hobbes. He's the main, we need an authoritarian government, a Leviathan, in a classical sense, that he spoke of the need for a Leviathan. And we need to understand why, his logic, right? Based upon what beliefs and values and assumptions? Well, his assumption was that in nature we're at a state of war with each other. Therefore, the role of the government is to mute the nature of mankind. If this, then what? If we are violent by nature, we need to be controlled. That's why we gave up our natural liberty to our government. People willingly did that because that was the only path to a good life. Life can only be good in the security of a Leviathan. Because in freedom, I will murder you in your sleep to steal from you. We have other collectivist philosophers, like Karl Marx. But if the source is about politics or social interactions, Marx is not our best tool. Marx is our economic collectivist philosopher. As too was Owen, but Owen and Marx do not agree on everything. Marx is an authoritarian socialist, and Owen is a democratic socialist. Owen did not believe in authoritarian state. So we need to distinguish. But in our cast of characters, we already have some others. We have Peter Singer and the Lottery of Birth. So when we drop names in class, we need to, even if you don't catch their ideology straight away, we need to write down the name. Okay, Peter Singer. I'll ask about this next day if I don't figure it out. Lottery of Birth is an attack on individualism, saying that, because we cannot predetermine who we're born to, which families, some people are born into greater opportunities than others. So under individualism, under capitalism, Donald Trump is born, Justin Trudeau is born into privilege, that even if I have more merit, I cannot have the same success. We also have a whole group of pro and anti-authoritarian leaders. Philosophers. On the pro-authoritarian side, I threw a whole list of people at you. Sorel and Schopenhauer and Gentile and Mussolini. And, combined, they're talking about submitting to a stronger will. Submitting to the state. Our life does not have purpose until we submit to the state. It's only through service to the state that our lives have purpose. And then we have the opposite voice, these people that are saying, no, submitting to the state's wrong, anti-authoritarianism. We would talk about George Orwell in 1984 and the warning in that dystopian novel about what happens when we do submit to the state, how life becomes a little more limited. So this side of the board looks at ideology, looks at the political side, the comparison of where we are in terms of change, and then we started to talk about specific people and individualism and collectivism. Another way to look at what we've been up to is look at it chronologically, the blue stuff at the top of the screen. So chronologically, the textbook, in chapter 3, when they talk about the evolution of liberalism, that they refer to feudalism as a time when there was a collective identity. You belong to the land. You belong to the village. The village was the village of your ancestors. And it should be the village of your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You also had this idea of submission and obedience to the church and to you don't question the monarchy, the absolute monarchy, the divine right. So feudalism was a very collective time. There's the crown land, the public land that people farmed together. But beginning with the Enclosure Act, and really furthered by the return of Greek philosophy following the fall of Constantinople, we see this rebirth of individualism called the Enlightenment. And those are the key individuals, the Locke's, the Mills, the Voltaires, that began to question the order and said that we can progress. They're liberal voices. some of these ideologies get manifested into a new economic system. When you combine science and innovation with capitalism, we have the Industrial Revolution. And what do we need to know about that? Well, we need to know that economically, the Industrial Revolution began to thrive under capitalism. And I have this in red, and I have no idea what the camera's looking at, and I'm scared to move it because then the video will cut out, but I really need you to be able to describe both the successes and the failures of the Industrial Revolution. How it unlocked, mass production. It created a higher standard of living. It allowed people to really, consume globally and to live more than just locally. Urbanization led to an explosion of public health care, public education. That we can look at the growth of human population, and there's an explosion following the Industrial Revolution. And we can look at the growth of the size of the world economy, and there's an explosion following the Industrial Revolution. That it seems to have unlocked greater potential in mankind. But at the same time, there's a negative side effect. Socially, it changed the soul of man. Changed us into a more selfish, individually driven species, and sometimes we prey upon others. And we see that economically in the factories, as children are specifically targeted because they're vulnerable. I also want you to be able to describe the flaws of the Industrial Revolution, the disparity of wealth, the exploitation of workers, and see how that leads to these responses, chapter 4. How did these flaws inspire the variety of responses? The Luddites, the Chartists, the Socialists, and the Communists. How did all of these groups, how were they inspired by flaws they saw within the Industrial Revolution? Luddites, machines were taking away jobs. Let's destroy the machines. Very reactionary thing to do. Chartists, the government only represents the needs of the wealthy. Their solution, we need the franchise for all men, not just wealthy men. Socialists and communists believed in greater redistribution of wealth to the extent that communists believed in the need for a class warfare, class struggle. This leads me to the economic spectrum. In the economic spectrum, we have classic liberals. We have classic liberalism economically is Adam Smith. We need to say, what are Adam Smith's values? Going back to the beginning of this, right? What are his assumptions? What is the role of government he thinks of? What is the role of citizens? Well, he values self-interest. He values individualism, right? So he must assume mankind's rational. The role of government, therefore, is to get out of the way, hands-off business. Government should ensure competition, so not allow monopolies. Government needs to protect private property through legislation, and that's it. Role of citizens, be guided by your own invisible hand of greed. Whereas what we're shifting into chronologically in this course now, as we go through the progressive era and another round of exposing flaws into the Great Depression, we're going to see classic liberalism morph into modern liberalism. Not freedom from, but freedom through government. And this is Keynes's idea, right? Keynes, kind of a mix of the two, individualism and collectivism. And Keynes is saying that man needs government intervention. Government is beneficial, is his assumption. Government is efficient, is his assumption. His assumption is we won't become somehow dependent on government. Like others in the future, like Hayek would say, it's the road to serfdom. His assumption was we won't become somehow no longer motivated to work for ourselves. So the role of government under Keynes is to assist those who need assistance through fiscal and monetary policy. At this point, you should be sitting there saying, I have no idea what those mean. You will after we study the Great Depression. Role of citizen under more of a modern liberal society, to support the government, you need to pay taxes. You need to give them the financial basis to intervene on behalf of those needing intervention. But we also have socialists and communists. What are their values? What are their assumptions? Well, a value of a socialist might be collective interest instead of self-interest. collective responsibility. They might assume that the government should redistribute wealth and that individuals are a brother's keeper. Whereas further, communism, it's not just about collective responsibility, it's about egalitarianism. Everyone should be equal. Assumptions that a paradigm shift is possible towards empathy towards each other. The role of government is to command the economy, command all society, to indoctrinate us, to lead us to that new ideology, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. What should citizens do? Follow the state and help each other. So we have this economic spectrum, we have this political spectrum, and you may recall that there was a time that we combined the four, or combined the two and created a quadrant, So you could have somebody that is in favor of freedom and freedom. They're a democratic capitalist. You might have somebody that believes in economic freedom, but political control. Then they are an authoritarian, political control, economic freedom capitalist. Authoritarian capitalism, that's just fascism. You might be still a little unclear of fascism. We haven't studied Nazi Germany yet. Once you read chapter 5 and study Nazi Germany, it'll make greater sense. You might believe in control and control. You want authoritarianism politically, and you want socialism. Authoritarian socialism is communism. Also chapter 5, also a chapter that we'll have to do in the future still. You studied it in grade 11, but we'll study it in more detail this year. And you might believe in, political freedom, but economic control, democratic socialism. And we pretend that's Sweden, so that we have a nice, easy example. So what else have we been up to? Well, we've also been studying economics. What is economics? It's our way to deal with scarcity. How do you deal with scarcity? Well, we need to answer 3 questions. What do we produce, how to produce it, and who gets what is produced? How you answer these questions needs to reflect your ideology, your beliefs and values. If you believe, or if you value everyone's equal, then you're not going to say who gets it, well, whoever can afford it. That doesn't reflect your values. So the way you answer these questions must come back to the beginning of the course. And again, the economic spectrum would be possible solutions, possible ideologies for those 3 questions. And where we're headed in this course is we're going to see the downfall of classic liberalism with the 1920s and the cause of the Great Depression. Then we'll see the shift towards modern liberalism through the Great Depression. And then we'll see some people freak out and say that this shift didn't work. It's created a culture of dependence on government. And it's created high taxes, and it's created massive debt. So you have Hayek and Friedman and Ayn Rand all saying, let's go back to Adam Smith. And then you'll have world leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan say, we're going to go back. That's where the course is headed this week. So, do you have any questions? Yes?
With the economic spectrum,
Yeah.
with like